It was supposed to be a trial run for the liberation of Europe, a daring amphibious assault that would test the defenses of Nazi-occupied France. But what happened on August 19, 1942, on the beaches of Dieppe was a disaster so devastating that it would shape the future of Allied strategy. This is the story of the Dieppe Raid, a tragedy of war, a lesson paid for in blood. By mid-1942, the Allies were desperate for a way to strike back against Hitler's fortress Europe. The Soviet Union was struggling against the full force of the German Wehrmacht, and Stalin was demanding that Britain and the US open a second front to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. The British knew they weren't yet ready for a full-scale invasion, but they believed a small-scale raid could provide valuable experience for future landings. The target? The occupied French port of Dieppe, heavily fortified by German defenses. Codenamed Operation Jubilee, the plan was to land 6,000 men, mostly Canadian troops, along a 10-mile stretch of coastline, destroy key defenses and withdraw after a few hours. The plan was ambitious, but tragically flawed. Before dawn on August 19, 1942, a massive armada of over 250 ships carried Canadian, British, and a small number of American and Free French troops across the English Channel. As the sun rose, they approached Dieppe, but their element of surprise was lost. As the landing craft neared the shore, they were met with a storm of bullets and artillery fire. The Germans were waiting. What followed was a massacre. The main force, landing at Puisan-Pourville, faced a nightmare. The beaches were narrow, covered with sharp stones and blocked by barbed wire. German MG-34 machine guns, positioned on cliffs and bunkers, tore into the Allied soldiers before they could even reach cover. Tanks meant to support the infantry couldn't get past the high shingle beach, leaving the men completely exposed. Within minutes, the operation descended into chaos. For nearly 6 brutal hours, the Allied troops fought desperately against overwhelming odds. The Royal Air Force clashed with the German Luftwaffe overhead while British warships tried to provide covering fire. But it was not enough. By mid-morning it was clear the Dieppe Raid had failed. Orders were given for retreat, but for many there was no escape. Nearly 60% of the landing force was killed, wounded or captured. Over 900 Canadians lay dead, making it one of Canada's darkest days in military history. The few survivors who made it back to England carried with them the scars, both physical and psychological, of the catastrophe. The Dieppe Raid was a disaster, but why? Historians and military experts point to several fatal mistakes. 1. Lack of surprise. The Germans were alerted, either by French resistance leaks or previous naval skirmishes, and had prepared their defenses. 2. Poor intelligence. The rocky beaches and hidden German positions were underestimated. 3. Insufficient firepower. The landing force lacked the naval and aerial bombardment needed to weaken enemy defenses. 4. Tactical errors. The decision to land at Dieppe, a heavily fortified port, was fundamentally flawed. The Germans had won a clear victory, but in doing so they gave the Allies invaluable lessons for the future. Despite the heavy losses, the Dieppe Raid was not in vain. It forced the Allies to rethink their entire invasion strategy. And 2 years later, on June 6, 1944, these lessons would help turn the tide of the war. Key lessons from Dieppe that shaped D-Day, sir. Massive pre-invasion bombardment was necessary to weaken enemy defenses. Surprise and deception were critical to a successful landing. Specialized landing craft and tanks were needed to navigate difficult beaches. Careful intelligence and planning were required to avoid another disaster. These changes led to the overwhelming success of the Normandy landings, which ultimately helped liberate Europe from Nazi control. The soldiers who fought at Dieppe paid the price for these lessons, and their sacrifice ensured that future generations would never forget the cost of war. The Dieppe Raid remains one of the most tragic chapters in World War II history. A moment of horror, but also a moment of learning. What do you think? Should the raid have ever been attempted, or was it a necessary sacrifice for the greater good? Let us know in the comments. Like, share and subscribe for more powerful war stories and history lessons.